Our story begins in the depths of the mines of Cornwall. The miners are digging out tin from underground to drive the industrial revolution that is really underway across Europe. But of course, crisis. There's a massive issue with the economy. It tanks, and so the price of tin completely falls, crashing the tin mines of Cornwall. And so what are these poor miners to do, Tavo?
I think that they should get on a ship and go to the Americas. That's just me.
So Argentina, Toronto.
Somewhere in between. Not too hot, not too cold.
Definitely not too hot, because they are going to the hills north of Mexico City in the state of Hidalgo, Real del Monte, and all the mines nearby. They won't be mining tin, though. They'll be reviving the mines that had been devastated by the conflict that was the Mexican independence movement. Destroyed a lot of Mexico's industry, which was mostly driven by mining, specifically silver mining. We've talked a lot about silver in the Mexico Political Economist, so I'll link that in the show notes. But, crucially, it was British miners, Cornish miners, because when Mexico becomes independent, the first country to recognize Mexico as independent is the UK, because they're very keen to open up Latin American trade, what would become known as Latin America, to British markets, because of course the British driving the Industrial Revolution. And so to revive these silver mines so that the Mexicans can pay for these British goods and trade, they send over an army of Cornish miners who are unemployed because the tin mines had gone under, pun intended.
It's actually an amazing place. Real del Monte and the nearby Mineral del Chico. These are beautiful, beautiful places. Coniferous forest. It's its own sort of microclimate and an otherwise quite warm state. Growing up, I used to camp in and around this area, and it's amazing. It's like something out of the Lord of the Rings. You'll be doing hikes through these massive forests, and then you come across like the exit of one of the many mines. You can hear the rivers that have taken over the mines once again, just flowing inside of the mountain.
And so one of the coldest places in Mexico is also actually exactly the right place for people coming from the warmest parts of the British Isles, which is Cornwall. And they bring with them their skills. They bring with them a lot of the equipment. They bring with them their styles. And so you go to Real del Monte, and a lot of the buildings feel like they're British. It's wonderful. And they bring with them their sports, namely football.
Now, it's very interesting to me, Alex, that Cornwall is featuring so much in my life recently, because I've recently become obsessed with the Bronze Age collapse, one of my odd obsessions. Apparently, the Bronze Age collapsed because of a series of things, but one of the things that happened is that there was a collapse in ancient supply chains, and one of those supply chains that collapsed was tin coming from Cornwall. And without tin, you can't have bronze. You can't have a Bronze Age. So who knew? Cornwall, center of the universe.
Definitely the center of Mexican football, because they turn up to the state of Hidalgo and they get to work, digging up the silver. But, during their off moments, they're out there making pasties. And so the local dish in Hidalgo is a dish known as pastes. And it's basically an English pasty, which is of an empanada, for those who can't imagine it. And funnily enough, the reason they're that shape is because you wouldn't eat the crust. The sort of crimp on the outside is made so that you can hold it with your filthy miner hands covered in really dangerous chemicals and mercury and all that. And so you don't poison yourself. So you're eating in the mine, you're eating a lovely meat pasty, and you don't poison yourself because you chuck away the crimp.
Now, of course, Mexican innovators as we are, the pasties are now full of like chicken with mole. No chicken and mushrooms, mole and tinga. So yeah, I think it's an improvement on the British pasty.
And so while they're eating their pasties and digging up their silver, they're also introducing football. And football becomes a thing in the capital of the state of Hidalgo, Pachuca, and it brings us, in the year 1900, the first official Mexican club team. So Club Pachuca is founded by these English, the descendants of these English miners in that context of Cornish mining in the state of Hidalgo.
What I like reading up on this, because I might add that never have there been two people quite as unqualified to talk about football as Alex and I. So there was a substantial amount of reading that had to go into being able to talk about this, at least for me. But reading about this, apparently like, yes, the miners come to Pachuca and they set up the Club Pachuca, but then football starts picking up, or soccer, as Americans would have it, starts picking up in Mexico. And part of the reason it picks up is because companies, British companies, see it as a very useful tool with which they can train Mexicans into, capitalism, basically. Just put them into teams and teach them rules and to work as a team with rules.
I didn't know that. And that's fascinating because that links us to this sort of industrial revolution tie that goes throughout this story, right? From the Cornish miners to the sort of getting Mexicans used to working in a team, but also under a very dictatorial boss.
100%. And I think it's very representative of, it also talks a lot about the very important role that Britain had in Mexico, or has had in Mexico. So I think we talk a lot about US influence in Mexico, and that is, of course, the big influence today and has been for many decades now. But in a net present value sort of way, Britain has been incredibly important in Mexico because this is the time of the British Empire, of course. They control the whole world. They never come and conquer significant parts of the Americas after the American Revolution because of the Monroe Doctrine, of course, and these sorts of things. But the spirit of, the sort of the East India Company and at the heart of the British Empire, going around taking over places through capitalism, is very much alive in Mexico and British influence in Mexico, mining being a very important example.
And it also sort of exemplifies the fact that these organized sports and the way they're sort of like rules-based and very much regulated has a lot to do with the history of industrialization, because standardization, all of that happens at this time. There are lots of sports in Mexico before that, but for some reason, not coincidentally, I think, a lot of the sports that Mexico knows and loves now arrive more or less at this time. What's interesting to me is, association football, football, didn't necessarily have to become Mexico's biggest pastime, right? I think it's, of course, a function of how democratic it is, right? As we always say, a couple of jumpers and a bottle of Coca-Cola will do you fine, whereas, luge, or other sports needs a different sort of more expensive equipment. But yet, as we covered in the Mexico Political Economist a couple of weeks ago, there's also the fact that this is when American football arrives, and maybe aspirational Mexicans, given that it arrives through the sort of elite of the country as opposed to English miners. The introduction of football makes it very popular at first. I think what's really fun is that a lot of the stuff that we've come to know and love about Mexican football is actually inherited from American football because it came from a sort of top-down direction. And who's dictating the rules? It's the people from the top down. And so, for example, the fact that Los Pumas, which is one of Mexico's sort of historic football teams, Los Pumas are actually originally an American football team based in the National University here in Mexico City. But the colors, the blue and gold, that comes from the University of Notre Dame, which is an American football team, the Fighting Irish. And the Pumas, the sort of the mascot, is also an invention of the American Football League that gets traduced into association football. We'll call it, from now on, whenever I say football and not American football, I mean soccer. And so all of that history, all of that lineage comes from a completely different sport that that people wouldn't usually associate with Mexico, in this case, namely American football.
It's also interesting because, this is the 1880s is when the Cornish miners come to Pachuca and start playing football. And then it's the early 1900s where you have the real appearance of Mexican football clubs. And at this time, this is still very much a European age. So I think doing the importance of these different non-Mexican sports in Mexican culture today, we see a lot of how the world was changing in the early 20th century, where you have, at the beginning, Mexico looking very much to Europe. This is, the Porfirio Diaz age. There's obsession with France. The British are very important in Mexico, but the US is rising. And they're importing ideas from both places at the same time. What I found really interesting on this, in the same vein, is that at the beginning, the majority of the clubs that appear after Club Pachuca, throughout the first couple of decades of the 20th century, is most of the clubs don't have a single Mexican in them. These are clubs set up by European diasporas that live in different parts of Mexico, mostly in Mexico City. You have, for example, the Amical Français from France, obviously. You have the Catalunya, the Real Club Español. You have all these different peoples who had moved to Mexico. They have the little communities there, and they start setting up football clubs and start competing between each other.
Wow, that's amazing. And so tell me about this. When is there this division? I'm guessing it has a lot to do with who's playing in the teams and who's funding them. So you've got these sort of, we'll call them hobbyist teams by the diaspora who are introducing the rules of the game and just, the game to Mexico. But then eventually you've got this interesting transition towards Mexican teams that are very much labor-based. And so that's why you get the Cementeros del Cruz Azul, right? Like it's literally a cement company creating a professional football team, which isn't completely ridiculous. It's not something that is unknown, right? Like it happens all over the world and across different sports. It's part of this sort of industrialization of sport, which is why you've got the Steelers or the Packers in NFL terms, or you've got the Cementeros here in Mexico. And I think that's a really interesting link between industry and the demands and capital behind industry and the creation of these football teams.
Definitely. I think, this brings us back partially to the story of how companies would use the teams to sort of instill sort of team principles into their employees and make sure they would be more productive and so on. Progressively, more and more Mexicans would become part of these teams, and thereby you could have sort of that sort of work culture permeate the company. There's also a time pre-revolution, so there's a lot of foreign investment in the country, a lot of major things in the company, like for example, the railways or the electrical company are owned by foreigners. So you have, if these sports are being played abroad and people from these countries come to Mexico, they set up a company, they bring the sport with them. And this happens all over the country. But at the same time, you have this thing where they're not as relevant anymore, but you still have these clubs, let's say, of the different diasporas of Europe. You have the Club Leonés, el Club Asturiano, el Club Francés. These are all clubs made up of people that came from these different regions of Europe. And everyone sort of manages they're able to use football as a way to sort of hold on to this latent nationalism or regionalism of theirs from wherever they came from originally. And have it out on the football pitch in a sort of constructive way. But things change a lot with the First World War, right? First World War happens, and lots of the people who were part of these diasporas actually go back to the old continent to fight. The Cornish miners, of course, but also lots of people from all the other diasporas. And it's at this time that Mexican sort of role in Mexican football clubs begins to grow. There had already been a team that was entirely made up of Mexicans in 1911, but by 1914, a lot of the foreigners leave, and you get a lot more teams made up exclusively of Mexicans.
I'm in awe. I'm just waiting for you to continue.
And that's the way it continues for years. Of course, Europe comes out a little bit battered from the First World War, and it's the rise of the US, of course. And it's a lot of American companies that now begin to have much more substantial investments in Mexico after the First World War. But they continue to leverage this sort of football culture that had already picked up. Interestingly, there's a club, the Necaxa, which is one of the clubs with the highest, sort of historical pedigree of the Mexican league, not as relevant anymore, but lots of historical pedigree. The Necaxa club was originally a club that belonged to the National Electrical Company, which after the revolution and the beginning of the PRI will be nationalized, and it will become Luz y Fuerza del Centro, which is the electrical company that then is forcibly disappeared by President Felipe Calderón in 2006. And the majority of the different clubs in Mexico, the clubs that are, very much loved and very much alive today, have a similar story where they are founded by things that are profoundly Mexican today. They might have not been originally Mexican when they were founded, but they become a core part of 20th century Mexican culture. So Luz y Fuerza del Centro is an emblematic company in the country all the way until 2006. It's at the heart of this sort of, state-run enterprise, very powerful union that is emblematic of the PRI and sort of the post-revolutionary 20th century Mexico. But other clubs have a similar story. For example, the Club America, which is the club with the most following in the country, also potentially the most hated club, but that's a different story. It is the club that has won the most titles in the Liga MX, which is the major national league. The America Club is founded by a group of Maristas, which is a Catholic group, which has a very relevant presence in Mexico, and they have a lot of schools. And they come together and they found the Club America, which plays in Mexico City.
It's a fabulous story because what you end up getting is a repetition of this trend in which, sure, you've got sort of civil associations creating, religion, diasporas, whatever, creating these football teams. But it always ends up being the corporates who end up taking control. And America is no different. It's actually probably the most fascinating club story because of who ends up behind the team. In 1956, a man called Emilio Azcárraga, known as El Tigre, is watching I think it's the Pan American Championship in Mexico. And he says, God, I bet people would like to watch this on television. And luckily for him, he happened to be the owner of the biggest television station in Mexico.
Would you look at that?
Yeah, it went through various iterations, but we'll call it Televisa because that's what it continues to be to this day. Televisa is very much linked to Mexico's history, very much linked to the PRI. It's sort of like the propaganda arm. It was its own company, but it was very linked to the sort of industrial and ideological project of the PRI. And fascinatingly, when El Tigre Azcárraga looks at this championship, he says, we should put this on television and it's going to make a lot of money. So therefore, I should buy a team. And so in 1959, 3 years after the championship, 3 years after he makes that decision to televise football, he buys El Club América. And to this day, Televisa is very much linked to El América.
And I think what's really interesting about the football clubs, and I suppose it's very similar in other countries, like for example in England. If you follow the story of the clubs, it really tells so much of the story of the country in a really interesting way. The America, with what you just mentioned, Alex, is so representative of 20th century history, right? It's civil society coming together, creating things afresh in 20th century Mexico. Then the PRI, sort of enterprises with significant state influence or state collaboration coming in, buying things, taking over. And then with time, capitalism just taking control of everything. And now, there's not really that much of a connection between Televisa and the government, not like they used to. But they continue to own Club América, and it continues to be incredibly successful. And then there's so many other clubs. The Tigres and the Rayados in Monterrey with their massive rivalry, one viewed as much more sort of elitist, one more like the working class. You have the Chivas in Guadalajara, the Cruz Azul, of course, the working class man's team created by a cement company. What is your perspective, Alex, of the Cruz Azul as someone who knows a little about football? If you had to say one thing about the Cruz Azul, what would it be?
That the stadium that used to be the one they played at is very close to where I live, and you could hear the games from here. And you can always tell the difference when it's a football game, when it's an American football game, when it's a concert. It's a different sort of scream, and I love it. But of course, I have no idea about what's going on in that stadium. It's a stadium that, by the way, has over and over been sort of, it's in the middle of the gentrifying areas of Mexico City, just south of Condesa. And so they've said, we've got to make apartment buildings or a mall there. And yet the stadium resists.
It's not what I was going for, but that is a very relevant part also of the Cruz Azul story, for sure. Would you say that they have a reputation for winning or for losing?
I mean, they're the eternal underdogs because they seem to be always losing.
Exactly. Everyone says that. Cruz Azul is always losing. The guy who's always almost there. I did some research. That is nonsense. It has won 10 major titles, whereas Chivas has won like 12. Like the only one who's won significantly more is Club América, which has won 16. But I don't understand why the entire country agrees that Cruz Azul always loses when they clearly don't always lose.
It's the vector, because they won so much initially that they've got a lot of fans, because the trend is, this is true of every sport, people are fans of winning teams. And so you'll get people who are very big fans of El Cruz Azul because their parents are fans, and their parents are fans because they came to football when El Cruz Azul was winning. And now that it's not winning anymore, it feels like it's always losing because it used to be a winner. And so it's the direction of travel that I think people associate that decline with.
That's fair. And it's a little bit like Necaxa, which, has this great pedigree. I think they're called like the 11 Heroes or something, the team that used to win in the 30s and 40s. And now, like the last time they won anything relevant was in the 90s, but people still love them.
I mean, we should definitely not get bogged down on technical football matters because there's so much knowledge. The intellectuals of football are actual, I think, intellectual giants. You've got in Latin America, especially, you've got people like Eduardo Galeano, who is the sort of the king of post-colonial, anti-colonial Latin American studies. and also the king of football. And I think that's very much linked. And in Mexico, we've got Juan Villoro, who is probably one of the most respected living intellectuals in Mexico. And his main obsession is football. In fact, he's got a lovely story, Juan Villoro, in his relatively recent book called La Figura del Mundo, which is a book about his father. And of course, one of the big things about him and his father is the fact that they were really into Necaxa, that team that you've been talking about that's sort of gone into decline. And part of the decline was the fact that they moved from their historical stomping grounds to Aguascalientes, which is a sort of middle of Mexico, kind of rural industrial city. Interesting, though, because Aguascalientes is the hub of lots of Japanese manufacturing, car manufacturing in Mexico. Toyota, Honda, and all that. And when he recently went, according to the book, Juan Villoro, to a football game at the Necaxa Stadium, he found himself surrounded by Japanese people. And he thought, well, that's weird. And of course, it's because they're all there in Aguascalientes, but also people really love the team because the colors of a Necaxa, accidentally, are the same colors as the Japanese flag. And so suddenly Necaxa's had this wonderful revival of an international fan base based in Japan because of a historical accident that has made the Necaxa colors red and white.
Yeah, it's the Nissan factory that is in Aguascalientes. So you have a bunch of Japanese expats living in Aguascalientes.
And so it's the wonderful serendipity of it all. The fact that Necaxa went to Aguascalientes, the fact that that's its colors, I think that's beautiful. And Juan Villoro relates it to the reader in such a beautiful way that even if you don't care about football, you really do care about this Japanese fan base around this specific Mexican club. I think that's part of the beauty of football, right? It's ultimately pretty random who you end up supporting. It's all to do with where you live or who your parents support. And you sort of connect your identity to that club and to that sport. And I think that's very much part of the Mexican sort of magic that's going on right now with the World Cup, which is a lot of people are coming to Mexico from around the world. And for the first time in a long time, the brand around Mexico isn't the terrible cartels and stuff. It's about how Mexicans live the sort of passion around football, and people are reminding themselves, oh yes, there is such a thing as the Mexican wave, which is sort of a massive part of Mexican identity to other people. In Mexico, it's just known as the wave. The fact that people love to party and go down to the Angel to celebrate Mexico's wins, and also the fact that the cathedral of football, probably worldwide, can be found here in Mexico City, the Estadio Azteca.
I think this is, doing the research for this, something that I found so interesting, because I've always wondered, why on earth does Mexico care so much about football if we're not very good at it, right? Mexico has made it to the quarterfinals twice. Ever. And despite that, when you look at like the list of who are the countries most obsessed with the World Cup, Mexico is always on the list. There's a list of people obsessed with football, and Mexico sometimes on the list, sometimes it isn't on the list. You have Argentina and England and Brazil are always on the list. But when it comes to the World Cup, Mexico is always up there, top of the list. People will, mortgage their house to go see a single match.
There's a wonderful stat, in fact, that says that by far the most oversubscribed ticket for this World Cup is matches that Mexico plays in. No other country comes close.
And what I think is also super cool about this is it's not just that Mexico really likes the World Cup. Is a little bit what you were saying, is Mexico has sort of made a brand, and this begins with the World Cup, of liking to celebrate, basically. It's obsession with the sport and just having a good time at the sport event in a way that really no one else does it. There's actually an example that I've seen from the least sort of, make a fuss kind of sport in the world, which is horseback riding. There's a very posh show jumping competition that goes around different locations in the world every year. It's the
Longines.
Exactly, the Longines Cup. And I remember once I was at one of the competitions in St. James's Park in London a few years back, and it was so posh, and people were wearing fancy hats, and when the horses would, when a particular rider would finish their circuit, people would just clap very lightly because you don't want to scare the horse. Everything is very restrained, right? But when you get the Longines Cup in Mexico City, which started about 8-9 years ago, the vibe is completely different. Like, despite Mexico being a horseback riding country, mega horseback riding culture, there is no sort of awareness of the fact that you can scare the horse. So like now they've managed to keep the crowds quiet while the circuit is going on, like while the jumping is happening. But the moment it finishes, people just like explode, like they roar.
I'm glad that they do that, because I think it's cultural it's a cultural imposition to force Mexicans to be quiet. Why? Because before Longines, Mexico's first Olympic medal was actually a horseback riding medal. And it was fascinating because it was clearly part of this revolutionary culture, the Mexican Revolution on horseback, where the horses, I don't think, would be that bothered about applause if they were used to explosions and machine gun fire. So really, all this quiet nonsense about like clapping, I think is an offense to Mexican horseback riding traditions.
I fully agree. And the horses can take it just fine. And the riders are now sort of prepared for it. And when there's La Ronda de la Victoria, like a little victory lap that you do when you've won. They'll play like the Jarabe Tapatío, like tapa tapa ta 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 ta, like full on volume, like mariachis everywhere. There's like confetti in the air, and the riders love it, and the horses seem pretty unfussed. But
we've forgotten to talk about football.
Damn it, we've done it again.
Yeah. Although it links perfectly, because that is more or less exactly what happens whenever there's a goal scored, at least by Mexico, because that's the only games I've watched. Whenever there's a goal scored, there's a wonderful tune known by all Mexicans.
Son de la Negra?
Son de la Negra, yes. Son de la Negra. And so it's part of this celebratory culture that I think really makes Mexico a wonderful place to be a football watcher rather than a football player. And of course, we could get into like all the corruption, all the issues that make Mexico's teams so subpar versus the amount of love that there is for the sport, but we won't get into that for now.
But I think part of the reason why, despite Mexico not being particularly good at the sport, or historically not being particularly good at the sport, hopefully that changes this World Cup. Mexico has, since 1970, when it first hosted the World Cup, because it's hosted it 3 times, 1970, 1986, and now, of course, 2026. And before we do these podcasts, I like to sort of fact check myself on a few things, because people all over the world, we grow up hearing that your particular country is particularly special at something, and you never really like double check that with someone. So I always have AI sort of tell me, is this actually true or is this not true? And I check it with different AIs to see what the different robots have to say. And this one is interesting because I asked, what are the most emblematic World Cups in history? Because I'd always grown up hearing that the Mexican ones were really emblematic. But of course, Mexicans would say that, wouldn't they? But all of the AIs agree in all of their lists that 1970 and 1986 are definitely amongst the most emblematic.
A quick question here. Did you say which is the most emblematic game, or did you ask the AI, is it right that this is the most emblematic game? Because AI is trained to agree with you.
No, I asked it, what are the most emblematic... actually started saying, who are the biggest fans of football? And Mexico came up in some of the lists. And then I went like, who's most obsessed with the World Cup? And Mexico came on the list. And then I said, which are the most emblematic World Cups in history? Different AI robots all said 1970, 1986. And then there was disagreement about the other ones. But 1970 and 1986 always shows up. The reason for that is varied. But one of the big reasons this links back to the Mexican brand of sort of having a party at sporting events, which is now not just in horseback riding, it's in the Formula One. Famously, several major players love playing in the Acapulco Open for tennis for the same reason. Mexico's famous for this sort of celebration at events, at sporting events. And it begins in 1970. 1970, you have the first World Cup hosted in Mexico. Many of the matches are played in the very famous and emblematic Estadio Azteca. And it's the first World Cup to be on television in color, which is already a big deal. And Mexicans become famous for being absolutely insane in the stadium. And they do this wave, which existed elsewhere. It's not a Mexican invention, but the way in which tens of thousands of people, because the Estadio Azteca is massive. It's massive now. It was stupidly massive for the standards of the 1960s and 70s. And having these tens of thousands of people, just everyone do the wave in the stadium, and people being able to see that in color on television for the first time was particularly special.
And I guess it also helps that people seem to agree that the best football team ever was the Brazilian football team that won that World Cup with...
Look at you, all that football knowledge.
It's something that I'm well known for.
Yes, and again, all of the AIs agreed that it's the most... I quote, the most beautiful playing of football in the history of football, Pele's team for Brazil in 1970.
Which, I assume that's how people win football, right? Not knowing much about the sport. It's a bit like synchronized swimming. It's the beauty of the game that wins you the game, right?
All the research you've done, Alex. Well done. Excellent. It really shows. Then 1986 is also very famous. Mexico's also partying and everything's great. Now it's like everyone knows that if you watch Mexico play football, you watch Mexicans watch football, it's going to be fun by this point. But what is really emblematic about the 1986 World Cup is because you have probably the most emblematic performance by a single player in history. And this is, of course, Diego Maradona.
Yeah.
One of the greatest teams ever. The Argentina team has the best player it's ever had. And that's even considering Messi with Diego Maradona. And he has the hand of God goal against the English. And it's still remembered as one of these extraordinary, before and after moments in football history. And all of that happened once again in the Estadio Azteca.
So does that mean that third time's the charm, this will be an equally iconic World Cup double, given that we are co-hosts with Canada and the US in this World Cup as well?
Who knows, of course, from the angle of football, which I know nothing about, I can't say. But the fact that this is the first time that you have the World Cup split between so many countries, and these countries who are historic allies and friends are at a bit of a row with each other, might make it emblematic for political reasons, for sure. But I think one of the things that already, a few matches into the World Cup, like we're not even in round of 16 yet, the fact that Mexico has doubled down on this beautiful brand of having a good time, I think is particularly great because it wasn't always so, right? Like, yes, with football since the 1970s, but Mexico is also infamous for not being a great fan sometimes in other things. Like famously, Queen said they would never come back to Mexico, Queen, the rock band, because fans threw rocks at them or something like that. And I think Mexico has really leaned into this, like, we're like to have a good time and we're nice about it. And please come here. It'll be great, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing in contrast with the other stereotype around Mexico of violence and, war and destruction. So hopefully that's a reason it becomes emblematic for it.
I mean, Octavio Paz would say it's part and parcel. The sort of the madness of the violence and the madness of the celebration are very much linked. Daisy the dog agrees.
But hopefully the thing it becomes most emblematic for is that this is the first time that one of the countries most obsessed with football in the World Cup ever actually makes it past quarterfinals this time.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see. And until next time.
I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks you're getting the best and most profound football analysis that there is out there.
To learn more about Mexican politics, economics, and its sports and celebration culture, subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist.
Till next time, toodaloo.